So welcome to our first lunch debate together with the OECD on digitalization and productivity. So this is a hotly debated topic since at least 15 years or something like this. So since 15 years, we observe a very slow productivity growth, not only in Germany, but also in many other industrialized countries. And this has created a huge debate, not only in academia, but also in politics. So is this just a measurement issue? Does this has to do with digitalization and things like this? And does do these low numbers of productivity growth mask probably heterogeneity across firms? And all these issues are relevant. And so we are very happy to have Alain, Giuseppe, Nicoletti, and Christina Timiliotis from the OECD here to present their newest insights on this issue. So Alain is Deputy Director in the Policy Studies branch of the OECD Economics Department. Giuseppe Nicoletti is the head of the Structural Policy Analysis Division at the OECD. And Christina is an economist of the Economics Department at the OECD. So thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oliver. And I want, on behalf of my colleagues, thank the IFO for inviting us, Mr. Fuest. Thank you very much. This is a very good for us to be here. We're very happy and to have this discussion. Productivity has been an issue we've now been working on, and Giuseppe has been leading the work on this for now quite some number of years, trying to get a bit deeper and the sources of the productivity slowdown. But the work we're going to present today, in this work we're looking at the relationship between digital technologies and productivity, focusing on European countries because this is where we have the data for what we're going to present today. So it's a bit more narrowing, looking a bit more specifically at one aspect, digital technologies, to what extent they contribute and how they contribute to productivity. And so we look at whether we can find evidence of adopting these technologies can boost productivity. And if so, why is it that digitalization has so little to show for it, at least in the aggregate productivity number? Why is it we don't see any better outcome? Now on this slides, if you see in the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusades, for those old enough to remember this legendary sequel of movie, the legendary Holy Grail in this case has the power to give eternal life provided you keep drinking out of it. And in the movie, of course, you discover that the Grail itself cannot be taken out from a pretty narrow, straight perimeter. So it's a bit like a jail in some ways. Our ambitions are, of course, a bit more modest and down to earth. The Holy Grail, in our case, refers to the productivity benefits from digitalization and to what extent we can find the Grail. So part of our quest consists in looking at the determinants of adoption of digital technologies. When I say that, let me see if this works. Right. When I say that the rapid advance in digital technologies has little to show for it, this is visible, of course, in the productivity numbers, which you're all familiar with. Oliver was just referring to this. We go back 3-4 decades, and what we see is a steady deceleration. We can forget the 70s because this was a period of rapid catching up in European countries vis-a-vis the US, explaining why productivity was higher there than in the US. But then every decade you see almost everywhere some sort of steady deceleration. And of course the deceleration was particularly sharp in the current decade following the crisis, and so evidently there's a number of cyclical or crisis-related factors behind the decline. Big drop in investment following the crisis, the consequences, the weakness of the banking sector, and in some cases which remains weak, loaded with non-performing loans, which means, among other things, that a number of very low productivity, low performing firms that actually should be exiting the market are being kept alive because of the problems of the banking sectors. And this is one aspect contributing to the misallocation of resources. Another one that came from the boom bust related to the crisis was, say, the shift of resources in some countries in some low productivity sector. Think of the construction sector in Spain or Ireland, which got inflated, and then the bust comes, and these workers cannot be easily redeployed in other sectors, especially more productive sectors. So these are all reasons to explain that contribute to the sharper deceleration in some of the countries over the current decades. But the point is that this slowdown in productivity precedes the crisis and started well before the crisis, as was mentioned by Oliver. We've now, in some cases, had already some clear signs of something more structural going on starting in the early 2000s. We've seen a decline in business dynamism, which started well before the crisis, and especially in the high-tech sectors. I mean, there's been a decline in business dynamism, which means entry and exit of firms going far earlier than that in many sectors, but the high-tech sectors, which probably plays a crucial role here, we started to see that around the late 90s, early 2000s, so coinciding a bit with the sharper slowdown in productivity. So the question that this raises is that, or this suggests that the slowdown has deeper and more structural causes, especially that also 10 years after the big recession, we still failed to observe some sort of genuine or robust recovery in productivity. So this indicates that perhaps we're facing a new puzzle or paradox in that we see innovation everywhere, innovation and digital technologies everywhere except in the productivity statistic. Now, this sounds familiar. You may remember the famous quote from Bob Solow in 1987. In this case, was about the dissemination of personal computers and saying you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. Now, for a while, we thought that this puzzle had been solved around the mid-90s, at least in the US, where we saw a burst of productivity growth prompted by high productivity in the ICT-producing sectors, which then led to higher productivity in ICT-using sectors in the early 2000s, but that didn't last, and now we're facing with what could be seen as a new productivity paradox. But this is one question, to what extent what we see really is a paradox or not. And in this case, there's no consensus among academics. You have on the one side some of the, sorry. Yeah. On the one side, you have the pessimists who claim that the IT revolution that we see is by no means comparable to previous industrial revolutions, and that it has and that IT has run out of steam pretty much, and so there's no reason to expect a big productivity burst or boom from IT. The optimists, in contrast, believe that the recent innovation have all the characteristics of a general purpose technologies, and one of these characteristics is that when this happens, such technologies need time to be deployed and need complementary investment in skills and organization for their full potential to materialize, and this can take number of decades before. So the jury is still out on this question, but one important contribution, at least we'd like to believe it is an important contribution to the debate coming from the OECD, has been to look more deeply at firm level and investigate productivity performance from micro data. And this is really the work of the past few weeks from a team led by Giuseppe, and which included other people like Dan Andrews, Chiara Criscuolo, and Peter Gad, and of course more recently Christina has been joining the team working on these issues. One of the things that they showed that the work from this team led is that one source and one factor that lies behind the slowdown in productivity, again starting in the early 2000s, has been a growing gap in the productivity performance of frontier firms at the frontier of productivity, the 3, 4, or 5% firms that are the frontier versus the laggards, versus all other firms. And this gap came up at around the early 2000s. Now here the chart shows that it is still continuing. It's been recalibrated or reparameterized at 2009, because this is the sample. 2009, 2015 corresponds to the sample of information we have used in this work. But really, this sort of spreading out, the frontier versus the rest, the best versus the rest, and the best taking off in productivity, and the laggards not being able to follow, started earlier, around the early 2000s. Now, the reasons for this divergence are not fully understood yet, but insofar as this is it is more pronounced in digitally intensive industries, there are reasons to suspect that digitalization is playing a key role, and this is what the difference you see here on the chart. You see the top line, which is the firms at the frontier. You see in some ways the growth in productivity much faster than the rest of the firms. And in some ways, if you just take productivity growth from these firms at the frontier, you get an average productivity annual growth of 3-4%, which is in some ways quite numbers that compares to when we had genuine productivity growth. So what this suggests is that the main source of the productivity slowdown is not so much a slowdown in innovation per se, but more a breakdown in the diffusion of innovation and productivity from the leading firms to the rest. Why is it? In the past, there would always be firms taking off, but eventually others would catch up, would look at what they do, copy their model, and eventually close the gap. In this case, at least there's no indication that this is happening, or at least at the same pace as in the past, and this directly has an impact on aggregate productivity numbers that we see. So that's one difference with the past. And in some ways, it confirms that there is a productivity paradox in the sense that these innovations, yes, can lead to higher these innovations can lead to higher productivity if only firms know how to make the best out of these technologies. So this is and also this is important as a factor to drive as a factor behind the productivity slowdown. It's illustrated from this chart here, because what it shows is that if these firms that are behind, all the firms that are at the bottom half of the distribution in terms of productivities, if their productivity, they don't necessarily have high share of output, and this is in some ways you don't expect them, if they're low productive, to have a high share of output, but if their productivity level could be brought up to the level of the median firm in the distribution, this would generate genuine gains in overall productivity of 4% in the case of the bottom 10% firms, and up to 6% in the case of the firms that are between the 10th and 40th%. So it does matter. I mean, we have on the one hand this debate between the techno-pessimists and the techno-optimists, and again the jury is still out as to whether and how important this will be for the future of productivity, and fair enough. But in the meantime, the point is that there are major gains in productivity to be tapped just by working and understanding what causes this sort of growing gap between leading and lagging firms, and what are the factors behind what explains the breakdown in the in diffusion of innovation. And so in trying to look more deeply at these factors and understand the role of digitalization in this productivity gap, the main thrust of the work that we're presenting, that we're releasing today, and which is in these publications that have been put on the table over there, is to look at the extent to which this gap between the productivity performance can be explained by a similar corresponding gap in the adoption and effective use of key technologies for which data on adoption rates are available. And some of these technologies here that can play potentially a key role, digital technologies, are mentioned here. One, of course, is the access to high-speed broadband, but then other ones are cloud computing, and two technologies that in some ways facilitate, better integrate front office and back office tasks in a firm: enterprise resource planning and customer relationship management. So these were the technologies that were the focus on the work we've done, and with the view to see to what extent there's a difference in the adoption rates of these technology, and whether this could help explain the gap in productivity between leading and lagging firms, and therefore the slowdown in productivity. Now, from these numbers, this shows that as you move across these technologies, the share of firms within industries adopting these technologies vary to some extent. It's especially if we look at Germany, which is the red bar, it's lowest in the terms of cloud computing. But the main point is that in most cases, it doesn't exceed 50%. A bit more in the case of the Nordics countries for high-speed broadband. So that means there are at least half of firms in most cases that are not using these, that are not have not adopted these technologies. And you can imagine that even among those that have adopted the technologies, do they have the necessary resource and know-how and skills to use them? So now the question based on that is to what extent we can explain what are the sources, the factors driving adoption rates of these technologies across firm, and to what extent the adopting these technologies does give a boost to productivity, and under what conditions. And what we found in a nutshell, and from here I'll leave the floor to my colleague Giuseppe to get a bit more into detail, is that the factors can be classified according to three broad categories. One is, of course, the high-speed broadband. That on its own is a key factor in helping adopting the other technologies. The second one is skills, having the necessary skills. The third one is having the right set of incentives. So some firms, maybe they do have the skills, but if they're not into a highly competitive market, they're not pushed to improve performance sufficiently, then there's not necessarily a big incentive to go out and adopt the technology, change the business environment to make the most of it. And so that has a lot to do with the regulatory environment in which firms operate. So from here, I'll leave it to my colleague to get a bit more into the details.
Okay, so so let me take from where Alain left. So he pointed out that there are very strong headwinds against productivity currently at the global level. And so the question we ask in the paper is, why isn't digitalization strong enough to overcome these strong headwinds, which many of them have nothing to do with digitalization, okay, and that are kind of behind the productivity slowdown. So one big problem is that, as Alain has pointed out, in fact, even though we have all a smartphone in our pockets, the number of firms around that adopt digital technology is not as large as one may presume. So there's a problem of diffusion of digital technologies. But then the other problem is that even the firms that adopt, often they are not able to reap all the gains that are potentially associated with adoption. So the challenge here is to see how policies, structural policies, and policymakers can implement structural policies such that at the same time they increase diffusion and facilitates the benefits from diffusion in all firms. So the work we've done in this series of papers is precisely to look at all the way from policies to adoption and to productivity. And as far as we know, at least at the cross-country level, there is no other work that has done that so far. In doing that, we find that we start from the assumption that there are two big factors affecting adoption. One is the capability to adopt, and the other one is the incentive to adopt. And both of these factors are affected somehow by policies. So that's what this flowchart is showing. And just to give you a preview of what are the main factors behind the relative weakness of digitalization in affecting productivity is that there is a shortage in capabilities, and capabilities here we mean managerial talent, skills that are related to ICT, and more generally other skills. And there's also perhaps a deficit in the incentives that the market give firms that do not adopt to adopt, and firms that adopt to use these technologies efficiently. So the important thing also to notice is that when a firm adopts, it has its own benefit, because within firm productivity can increase, but there are also a lot of spillovers from the fact that this firm is operating in an environment that has higher or lower adoption rates. So interacting with other firms that are also digitalized somehow produces benefits that go beyond the benefits of adoption itself in each firm. So there are spillovers. And in our work, we try to capture both, so that we have adoption rates at the industry level and firm level productivity. Okay, so what is the key word here? The key word is complementarity. So what we argue is that one of the reasons we don't see such an effect of digitalization, at least so far, we see it at the frontier, but there is increasing gap between laggard firms and the frontier, and in the aggregate it doesn't show up really in the productivity numbers, is that we're failing to take advantage of key complementarities that are a specific feature of these technologies. And there are three main complementarities here that we look at in these papers. The first is between technologies themselves. The second is between technologies and the market environment and the structural factors that characterize, structural features that characterize the economy. And the third one is between market factors themselves, so that the policies that affect both markets and the capabilities that the supply of skills that firms face. Now, let me give you an example. If I adopt high-speed broadband, then I can use cloud computing. Okay, so that's a key complementarity between two of these digital technologies. However, if I use cloud computing, but I have no managers and no workers that have the necessary skills to make something positive out of it, then of course it's completely a complete waste of money. Okay, and the problem is that in order to have talented managers and workers that have skills that are allocated to the right jobs, I need to have the right incentives from the markets, and I need to have, of course, the right supply of skills and of talented managers. However, so that means that, for instance, I have to have competition policies that put the necessary pressure on managers to to perform, and also at the same time, I need to have labor market policies that enable managers to reshuffle the workforce, reallocate factors so that one can use actually efficiently these technologies. So there are also complementarities between labor market policies and product market policies, for instance. Okay, so failing to take advantage of these three complementarities is something that can lead to weaker effects of digitalization than expected. Now, when we look at, when we do our analysis, one major challenge, and this is a challenge that also is faced by policymakers, in understanding what goes on is that data on digitalization by firms is very scarce. Now, fortunately, the EU, among the very good things that it does, is despite being criticized very much as well, collects such data. So the Eurostat is, produces basically the only data on firm-level digitalization that we have across countries currently, comparable data. And we don't have access to the firm-level data, but we have access to adoption rates by sector and by country over some years. Unfortunately, not many years, so we cannot do time series analysis, but there is a sufficient sample that allows econometrics to be done. So we take these Eurostat data on adoption rates by country and sector for 25 EU countries, I'm including Turkey in this EU definition, but this is the only outlier country that we have in our sample, and 25 industries. And we focus on firms that have more than 10 employees. And not only the Eurostat is collecting data on technologies, but also for different kinds of technologies at a very detailed level. So we focus on those technologies that we think have the potential to have the highest bang for the buck for productivity, which include cloud computing, high-speed broadband, and those softwares that allow to better organize the supply process and relationships with customers. Now, the other side of the story is how do we relate these technologies and the productivity that goes with it with policies. And there we look at, as I said, at two big clusters, capabilities, policies that affect capabilities and policies that affect incentives. And on the capability side, we have basically policies that affect managerial talent and worker skills, which are listed there. I'm not going through them in detail. And on the incentive side, we have policies that affect market, the flexibility and the openness and the pressure that markets put on firms, and also the extent to which they have access to finance. Overall, these two sets of policies, if appropriate, can lead to a good allocation of workers to the right jobs, and so a good match between workers and jobs, including among workers, of course, managers that are able to efficiently run firms and efficiently use digital technologies. So when we put together, on the firm side, on the other hand, I don't have a slide that shows the firm level data that we use, but it's basically the only cross-country firm level database, which is the Orbis database. And so on the firm side, when we put together this firm level database with the other data on adoption and on policies, we get this picture. So first of all, the first step, we look at the determinants of adoption. And we can see that there are a number of structural factors that are affected by policies that can potentially increase adoption substantially on average. This is on average. We have also country by country figures, but I'm not reporting them here. So they can increase on average the substantially adoption rates in OECD, in EU countries. The first factor is higher use of higher diffusion of high-speed broadband. So that has to do with incentives that the governments can give to rolling out broadband. Of course, those incentives have to be given, for a good reason. So, you need to have like cost-benefit analysis to do it. But it's not just. I'm not just calling for a kind of across the board subsidization of high-speed broadband. But you know, if we give the right incentives and we are able to increase the use of high-speed broadband, then adoption rates can rise quite a lot in those 4 technologies that we focus on. The other set of policies that is relevant is, of course, those affecting human capital. So upgrading skills in for both workers, you know, technical skills and managerial skills. Bit difficult to create a link between policies and managerial skills, but there are ways. We can discuss them later if you want. And then the other set of important policies is to you know, reform product and labor markets so that it becomes at the same time easier for managers to reap the benefits, you know, to use these technologies, and on the other hand, it becomes compelling, because if they don't, then they are sanctioned by the market. So competition policies, labor market policies that make labor markets more flexible, and so on. And then there are other factors that are listed there that appear to be a bit less important for adoption, but just because the data we have is EU data, so for instance, digital trade, barriers to digital trade within the EU are not very, very high, and so, you know, there's little variability there to be exploited. And the other one is the use of e-government, which can both directly and indirectly, but mostly indirectly, affect the propensity to adopt. Okay, so that's the first step, is to look at the effects of policies on adoption. But then, what's the next step? The next step is to look at how adoption can affect productivity. And here, again, we focus on this issue of failing to seize the complementarities that are there, because facilitating adoption is not the end of the story. Because adoption is not only an enabler for better productivity, but not necessarily leading to better productivity if one does not understand how to use them efficiently. So here I just want to give you 3 examples that we explore in our data of how these, you know, failing to use these complementarities can reduce the gains, the productivity gains of adoption. And the interesting thing is that failure to seize the complementarities seems to be related with the fact that the gains from adoption are very different across firms. So the best performing firms have gains from adoption that are much higher than the firms that are lagging behind. So this is what we see here when we look at the effects of adoption on productivity, and we make an experiment based on our estimates. We increase by 10% the rate of adoption in a range of technologies, and we look at the gains in productivity at the firm level, and we divide firms across the distribution of productivity between low productivity, medium productivity, and high productivity firms. You can see that, first of all, that the gains are significant. You know, we have gains that after 3 years, I think this is a 3-year, no, after 1 year, they are, for the best firms, for the best performing firms to begin with, they are 2% of multi-factor productivity, which is quite a lot. Second, you can see that for laggard firms, for firms that start with low level of productivity, these gains are halved. So that's a real problem, because for all technologies except cloud computing. Why cloud computing is having this effect? Because cloud computing is precisely the technology that allows firms that don't have the resources to invest in the necessary infrastructure that makes it possible to use new technologies to outsource these infrastructures. So that's an interesting thing, that cloud computing is allowing even those firms that to begin with have low returns and so low low ability to finance investment in technology, but they do benefits from a productivity point of view more than other firms. But in general, you see that there is a worrying trend here, because this creates a kind of a vicious circle in which firms that to begin with have low resources because they have low productivity, they will have lower returns from adopting, so they don't adopt. And the gap between the best firms and the low productivity firms will increase over time. Given that this gap is related also to gaps in wages, in average wages across these firms, this increases also wage inequality in the economy, and so it's related also to other important worrying policy issues. Okay, so the thing is that, as I said, I mean, this is a worrying picture, but this is without any policy action. Policies can do a lot. Like, for instance, exploiting the first complementarity between technologies. So it's a complementarity between different kinds of technologies. Can be very useful. You can see in these pictures, this is an exercise that looks at the effects on productivity of raising access to high-speed broadband, and looks at both at the direct effect on productivity and the indirect effect through the synergies that high-speed broadband has with, say, cloud computing, for instance. And you can see that the gains in multi-factor productivity after 3 years can be very big. So exploiting this kind of complementarity can be very, very fruitful for productivity, and to the extent that policy is able to induce such investments, it can really change the picture. The second complementarity is between human capital, so human capabilities, let's say, and new technologies. In this picture, you see an experiment which is to look at the effect that increasing availability of skills, of different kinds of skills, would have on productivity, depending on which industry we are in. Whether we are in industry that has a high skills shortage, sorry, let me take it back. So this shows the effect that increasing adoption of different technologies, of a mix of technologies, would have on productivity, depending on whether we are in an industry that has high shortage, medium shortage, or no shortage of skills, in different kinds of skills that have to do with managerial talent and with ICT skills of the workers. And you can see that in industries that have low skill shortage, the gains in productivity to be obtained from increasing adoption of digital technologies would be larger than when you have a shortage of skills. So this is to say that if you are able to at the same time increase skills and incentivize adoption, then you're going to get higher returns than if you do it separately. Okay? So this is another source of complementarity, and it is particularly important for low productive firms. In this figure, we set at 100 the productivity gains that the best firms would have from an increase in adoption of a mix of technology, by 10%, the adoption rates by 10%. So we put it at 100 for the best firms, and we look at what happens for low productive firms, what would be the gain in productivity for low productive firms in two kinds of industries, industries without skill shortages and industries with skill shortages. Now, we've seen already that on average, low productive firms will gain less than high productive firms. But in industries without skill shortages, this short fall in productivity for low productive firms would be around 10%. In other industries with high skill shortages would be 30%. So there is a kind of a double dividend in at the same time encouraging adoption and eliminating or reducing skill shortages, especially for low productive firms. And since we know that one of the causes of the productivity slowdown is the increasing gap between low productive and best productive firms, laggards and frontier, this is a way in which we could really make a difference and support productivity in the future. Third, complementarity between policies. So complementarity between policies that affect the structure of the economy, capabilities or incentives. In this figure, we see the effect on productivity of filling up the gap, half of the gap between EU countries and the best performing countries in three areas, in two areas. In the area of work practices, there's something called high performance work practices, which measures the extent to which managerial talent is able to implement modern work practices that give incentives to workers, and so this is capturing that part of the story. And the dark blue part of the bar is the effect of policies that affect markets, improve the functioning of the labor market, enhance competition in product markets, and also by both increasing competition, but also by improving insolvency regimes and decreasing barriers to digital trade. And you can see that the first two blue bars, they measure the effect that implementing these policies separately would have on productivity after 3 years, which is already not bad, 3% of increase in multi-factor productivity. But then if these two policies are implemented together, then there will be an additional 25% gain that brings the overall gain in productivity to 4%. Okay? And this is, again, this goes back to the story I was mentioning in the beginning, that it's kind of useless to improve the supply of managers if you don't at the same time improve the market conditions that give incentives to these managers to manage efficiently. Okay, so that's the third complementarity. So I'm on my final slide before I give back the floor to Alain, is that there are worrying trends. We don't see much on aggregate productivity from digital innovation, but there are ways in which policymakers can make a difference and try to maximize the gains from digital adoption. And these ways, I'm not repeating, but they could overall bring gains in productivity that are quite significant. For instance, we estimate that policies that lead to an upgrading of skills, both technical and managerial, would imply an increase in multi-factor productivities after 3 years in the average EU countries. Here it says OECD, but it's an error. It's EU of around 3.5% percentage points. So that's not insignificant, and we think that it's a matter for reflection for policymakers. So I'm giving back the floor to Alain to finish.
Unless you want to stay close. Okay, with the promise that we're coming close to the end. So this is time maybe to do a bit of a summary. So through this work, we've identified a number of elements that could contribute to the productivity puzzle and at the same time help find remedies or ways to address the puzzle and help boost productivity. One of them, of course, to begin with, is the low diffusion or unequal diffusion of digital technologies, which Giuseppe has mentioned and explained. The second barrier is that the stronger productivity benefits from digitalization for the best performer. So firms that are already better, more productive are the ones that tend to benefit most from these technologies. The third element is a strong complementarity of both adoption and its productivity benefits with intangible investment, and these are especially hard to implement for laggards. The need to do this complementary investment, and it requires good managerial skills, and it's not easy for many firms to do that. And finally, the fourth one is the sobering productivity effects from the skill gaps that are especially difficult again to fill for the laggards, a bit more of a steep hill in their case to overcome. But at the same time, this means that from the work that has been done, the following policy priorities can emerge, or at least these are areas where some good benefits could be had in terms of addressing the puzzle. One, of course, is the regulatory frameworks, working on the incentive, the regulatory frameworks to support investment in broadband and pro-competition reforms in telecommunication sectors, so as to provide a cheaper, broader and cheaper access to high-speed internet. The second, of course, points to the skills problem and the participation in training, especially of low-skilled workers, and its quality, as well as promoting good cognitive, organizational, and managerial skills. This is a big and challenging program. We all know the problem of most countries. It's already the better skilled worker who have access to training. In most cases, the gap between those who have the high-skilled worker and their access to training and the proportion of low-skilled worker access who have access to training is very high. So far, at least, very difficult to find a country that has been doing well in getting more low-skilled workers into training, let alone organizing this lifelong training programs that everybody talks about, but we don't really see yet in reality. So again, this at the same time transforming the school systems, basic schooling, to give the types of cognitive and non-cognitive skills that will enable workers of the future to navigate more easily between different tasks as these changes are expected to change more rapidly. Finally, the third element is has to do with the creating an environment that gives good incentives to firms to adopt and make the most of these technologies, and this has all to do with the regulation having an impact on the entry and exit of firm, but as well as on the reallocation both within and across firms and across sectors of labor. And at the same time, of course, given that we have seen that as Giuseppe mentioned, the growing gap in productivity across firms has in the mirror image of this, or in parallel, there's a growing gap in wages. This has an impact on the dispersion of wages. This can also be good for adopting these measures can be good for improving inclusiveness. Now, Giuseppe showed just before finishing this chart, which showed the impact of adopting technology for the average EU countries. Now, just to see what it means for Germany, as you can see, in most cases, it's Germany is close to the average, not very different. It's a bit higher in the case of high-speed broadband and a bit lower in the case of upgrading skills, which means that Germany is already doing better in the case of skills than the average EU countries. But for the rest, the expected impact for Germany is not much different from the average, which means it is substantial in many of these cases, especially if you sum them up. And so I think we'll stop here. Thank you for your patience and indulgence, and we're happy to discuss this further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Oliver, for giving me the opportunity to comment on this. First of all, I'd like to say, as you can see, this is not a men-only panel, but I'm afraid you'll have to say a few words, Christina, after myself, because otherwise it's going to become one.
All the hard questions will go to
absolutely, I thought that was your plan. I suspected that. So first of all, let me say, I think this is tremendously important work. It is maybe one of the most important questions in economics these days. Why is productivity growth declining? Productivity is the basis of prosperity, and we should be worried that productivity has been declining for so long, as you've shown. So this is not something technical. This is tremendously important. Maybe this is the most important question in economic policy, or even in economics today. And so I think this is very useful work. At the same time, I think so this presentation had to go very quickly from some stylized facts to policy conclusions. And I think because this is so challenging, it's maybe good to take a step back and maybe discuss other interpretations of the evidence. This is challenging because it's basically impossible to or let's say very difficult to measure causal effects of variable X on variable Y, as you've also explained in great detail, in fact, in your papers. And so what I would like to say is I think it's useful to think about the three stylized facts we have. Overall decline in productivity, 1, increasing productivity divergence, 2, across firms, and 3, more diversion in digitized industries. Now there are different ways of interpreting this. One, and some interpretations are simply, is this not working? Some interpretations are in fact mutually exclusive. So declining competition could be the problem. That would be one story. So if we are witnessing a decline in competition and an increasing role of monopolies, what we would expect is an overall decline in productivity, because monopolists reduce quantities and produce less, so they are inefficient. This would be compatible with these differences across firms, because some firms are the monopolists; they capture the markets, and they and other businesses, for whatever reasons, don't. But it would be compatible with divergence, and it would be, if that's what's driving things, this would also be compatible with the divergence being stronger in digitized markets if, for instance, the decline in competition is stronger in digitized sectors because marginal costs tend to be low and digitized markets are more prone to monopolization. So if that's the problem, we should think about competition policies to address that. It could also be that too much competition is the problem, which would mean that, okay, we have natural monopolies, increasingly IP plays an increasing role. That would mean we have more and more low marginal cost companies, and it is actually efficient to have fewer firms. Okay, and maybe we are preventing that. I think that's what our economy minister believes. We are preventing that through competition policy. So we are actually, that story would tell you competition policy is standing in the way of productivity increases. I think we really need to understand this, because the policy implications are, exactly contradictory. And then I think it's also important to think hard about other aspects of the policy implications. For instance, you mentioned spillovers. So I think it's very important for us to understand, is there a major problem of spillovers? Maybe spillovers are smaller, uninternalized spillovers are less of a problem for large companies. That would imply large companies do invest more in digitization or technology adoption than small companies, because small companies internalize less. Again, that would explain the stylized facts here. And I guess the solution would be, we would have to have something like R&D tax credits for smaller companies precisely, and not for larger companies, because that's where the problem is. And that would also mean investing more in small companies is a good idea, because we have an underinvestment problem. It could also be that the large companies are simply better. They have the smarter managers. In that case, it would be bad to invest more in the small companies. If the policy implication wouldn't be, let's invest more in the small companies, because that would be a waste of resources. Maybe we should do it precisely the other way around. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I think this is very challenging, but we do need to understand better the sources of market failures going on here, because otherwise we really don't know what to do. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot for your comments. I really appreciate being here. I think you raised a couple of really important issues that we're obviously also aware of, but as we state in our study, this is merely the beginning. We have so little data, and there are so many issues related to digitalization that we cannot all cover, of course, in this study. One of which being the decline in competition, which we definitely see in other studies, for instance, by our colleagues in STI. What we see is that the big firms that are highly productive and also very digitalized and operating in digitalized sectors as well, increasingly just buy the smaller firms, and in so doing, of course, the competition declines. Now, what the consequences of this for competition policy would be, that's a totally different field, I would say, and also one that is heavily discussed right now at the OECD. So probably I'll give this question to Alain afterwards, because yeah, that's very specific. Then the other question related to investment, I think definitely incentives are needed to invest more in intangible assets, and of course also that encompasses digital technologies. You mentioned R&D tax credits. From what I understand, Germany is thinking about some reforms related to R&D tax credits. Those are definitely important. Now, what will be important is that you don't subsidize small firms in particular. So you want to create an environment, of course, where they do invest more, but you don't want to give them an incentive to stay below a certain threshold. So they need to invest more, and especially into R&D or knowledge-based assets, but you don't want to incentivize them to stay small. That's a really important point here. And maybe, yeah, I'll just hand over to Alain.
Yeah, if I may just add to what Christina has mentioned, of course, these are very, very, very good key questions. The first one on the competition, and as she mentioned, we have colleagues who have looked at it from looking also at markups, and to what extent they have evolved and differently, and not too surprisingly, I guess, not only in when we see the biggest increase in markups, not just what we saw for productivity is also the case for markups. Where we've seen the biggest increase is in highly digitalized industry, where you see a really big increase over time in markups. Now, there can be a benign or a less benign story behind this. The benign story is to say, this is the results. We're dealing here with cases of externalities and increasing returns to scale due both to supply side and demand side network effects. And these firms, it's a characteristic of investment in intangible or in knowledge-based capital that you tend to gain high returns to scale. And this may lead in some case, some of the extreme case in the winner takes most or winner takes all dynamics. And so in some ways, this is an efficiency outcome to see some of these firms growing to the point that they dominate their market. Now, the less benign story is that they've also get there through other means, that as they get some power and get use their profits to entrench their position in the market,
And of course, this is and one thing that they may start to do is what Christina was mentioning, is to start fending off potential threats by buying off firms that could eventually become competitors to their position, and they're buying us. So, and in fact, what can happen is this movement can start by being efficiency, but once these firms reach a certain degree of domination in the markets, then they're less turned towards innovation, but to shift their resource into entrenching their position. I'm not saying we're there. It's very difficult to assess, but this is one of the risks we may be facing. And related to that, you mentioned this idea about should we invest in small firms if indeed most of the benefits come from the dominant or the most performing firms. Again, there's two ways when we see this big gap between high productivity frontier firms and the laggards. There's two ways we can close. We can say improve productivity by closing this gap. One is to have the resources shifting from these low productivity firms to high productivity firms, and having the high productivity firm gaining more and more and more of the market shares. The other one, the one which we prefer, for the sake of preserving not only competitive pressures, but variety, quality, innovation, is to help the laggards, those at least who have the possibilities, the potentials to catch up, helping those to catch up, to be catching up through the policy measures, to avoid, again, having too few firms dominating in the position in the market.
So we have time for questions, for your questions. Are there?
Thank you very much. I wonder what issue or what cybersecurity plays a role in this productivity equation. I know of a company who receives about 16 million external emails per year, 50% of which are malware or spam. If you think about production breaking down for 3 weeks if they were hacked, this obviously does have an effect of productivity.
Shall we collect questions? Are there further? Yeah, okay. Thomas.
My question would be, what is the role of the business model of a firm, for example? So just take it to the extreme. So if you just take a look at the steel company on the one hand, and put more ICT investments and skills there, I would probably guess that the increase in productivity is fairly limited. But if you take the same endowment, for example, to Amazon, Google, Netflix, and ICT producing firms, what we have seen in the past, the increase of productivity could be immense. So you not only increase output, you lower inputs. The question would then be here, is there a role of the business model of the firm? And if so, let's go one step further. Is there some kind of natural barrier for productivity growth for a lot of firms, like the steel company? And if so, can structural policy do anything about this, if at all?
Further questions? So I have one. So I agree with 2 of your policy conclusions. I'm not so sure about the other. It is about the broadband infrastructure. So what we see, for example, in Germany, that broadband infrastructure is now widely available, but neither firms nor households use it. And this is not a question of the price. So Germany is one of the cheapest countries for high-speed broadband subscriptions. So I wonder whether these supply-side policies are really helpful and whether we should think more about demand-side policies that really increase take-up.
I can have a go maybe at the first two, and I'll let you with the third one. Of course, you can complete whatever I said. Same for you, Christina. On cybersecurity, this is a very serious issue, serious enough that we have pressure to look at this at the OECD. Some of our colleagues from the science, technology, and innovation have been looking at this, but not to the point of being able to give even some rough estimates of how much, to what extent it has an impact on productivity. Part of it is that it's not so easy to get to the extent of the exposure to cybersecurity threat, but also firms being victims don't always come forward to say, to tell that they've been affected, that they've been hacked and had to pay some ransom to. So it's difficult to say how widespread the problem is, but evidently this is a serious issue. But unfortunately, at least as far as I know, I haven't seen any study that puts a figure in terms of how it affects. But evidently, it requires resource continuously, and we know in our shop and everywhere in terms of being always up to date, in terms of being able to have a system that is robust to cyber attacks. So definitely, it must have an impact on productivity, and but one that is hard to assess. On the business model, and Giuseppe can correct me if I'm wrong, but yes, the intuition would be that this type of technologies, it may be finally the thing that unlocks productivity in services. Not that productivity in service has been that bad over time, but we know that there's always this intuition that it's harder to get steady and strong productivity gains in services as opposed to manufacturing. And so in some ways, if this is one area, and especially as our economies move more and more towards services, if there's a bigger impact in services, but that's, to me, this would be good news in some ways. However, my recollection from the results from this study is that the impact of digital technologies on productivity is a bit stronger in manufacturing than services. This is what I found on the basis of these data. So sometimes this intuition is not necessarily corroborated. It requires a bit further work, but that's one element.
Yeah, indeed. Basically, what we find is that it's where it's easier to replace routine tasks. Where there are more routine tasks. In services. So concerning the business model, I think the first answer is that this is an industry level analysis. So the results are more or less valid for all industries. But if you look at a finer level and you try to distinguish between different industries, you have this kind of stylized fact that the effects of adoption on manufacturing is stronger than on services. And I mean, it's, I am not sure that there is, that a priori would expect that technologies like enterprise resource planning or customer relationship, management relationship, customer relationship management would be more beneficial in one industry than another. I mean, the more all these technologies, what they do is they make supply chains more efficient, either on the back side of the office or on the front side. So they affect more or less equally all sectors of the economy. So that's, and on the, and then there's this aspect of the routine tasks, which is on one hand kind of disquieting, because it would mean that the productivity gains that we observe are obtained by shedding labor, and so there is a what we gain in productivity we lose in in jobs, and that's a bit worrying. On the broadband, it's a difficult question because I mean there is a lot of literature showing that improving access to broadband is good for productivity, you know, both at the aggregate, the industry, and the firm level. So the question is, of course, there is an endogeneity issue. There are a lot of issues there that maybe empirical analysis cannot solve, you know, once and for all. But clearly, you know, what we try to highlight in this work is that there is a crucial complementarity there, and that whether it's a demand or a supply factor, I don't know. But the fact is that if you don't somehow achieve a stronger penetration of high-speed broadband, then you are kind of handicapped in adopting other kind of technologies. So that's I think the safest conclusion that one can have from this work. Just one word about small versus large companies. What we find in the work is also that productivity gains do not differ across depending on size. So that's an interesting thing. We were expecting some effects of this kind, but in fact, the only thing that we find as significant is difference in initial productivity, but independent of whether it's a small or a large firm. So again, I mean, this would point towards policies that do not target subsidies on size, based on size, which unfortunately is often done in OECD countries, but more on growth potential, which is much more difficult, of course, you know, because it's not clear how to identify the firms that have you know, a potential to grow or to innovate and so on. But it's a challenge that policymakers should be taking if they want to avoid to waste money and perhaps create further barriers to entry for more innovative firms, you know, by like subsidizing incumbents. Christina, sorry. It doesn't work.
I don't think does it work? No. No? It looks good. Okay, sorry, it sounded like it wasn't. Yeah, just related to the question on broadband, where you say that this is not a supply side issue. I think the same holds true for the other technologies. We have cloud computing, we have ERP. It's not a supply side issue. It's merely that there is too little, not no, but too little demand for it for the moment. And why is that? So firms apparently don't see the necessity for the moment to adopt these digital technologies. Why is that? Because of a lack of competition. They, you know, they don't see how this investment, what fruits this investment is going to bear in the long term. So what policy makers will need to do is raise awareness about the use and the benefits from digital technologies. Because if we take one step further, AI, for instance, a lot of people expect that there's going to be a tipping point. This is not going to be a gradual introduction, but you're going to have AI, and then all of a sudden, you know, you're going to shed a lot of labor, and the productivity benefits are huge. So you don't know what's going to come in the future, and you just need to raise awareness within, you know, for firms basically, that things are going to change, and we don't know how quickly things are going to change. That's a really important aspect. And for instance, Canada is doing, and we at the OECD are also doing foresight exercises to simulate, or at least to discuss what might happen in the next 20, 30 years, and how firms should respond to this and what they can do right now to anticipate these changes in the future. So, okay, there may be no supply side issue, but on the demand, more things could be done from the government perspective as well.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for joining our IFO OECD lunch debate, and again, thank you to our presenters.
Maybe just one last point. We brought from Paris so many copies, and we're not going to take them back. So if you want to take one, feel free. Yeah, totally digital, of course.